Welcome to Health Oddity, the show that strips away the jargon and hype surrounding all things health and fitness to help you live a long, strong and energetic life. Lining up at the bar this week, here's Peter Lant, Paul Bassett and James St. Pierre.
Hello and welcome to the Health Oddity podcast, episode 212. Now, if you are listening on the day of release, which I know many of you do around the world, it is the 20th of September 2024. And we're going to be talking to a very interesting guest today who has an event coming up, which is applicable and appropriate for you if you are based maybe in the southeast of England, but if you are not based in the southeast of England, I'm sure we're going to have lots of interesting stuff and information that you will find very useful as well. So do have a good listen. First of all, I'm just going to welcome and introduce our usual co-host, Mr. Peter Lant, who is in Bath in Somerset. How are you doing, Pete? You okay?
I'm knackered, is what I am. But yes, I'm fine, thanks.
Even Pete was just telling me he hasn't had a day off for a long time, and next weekend we're at Brunel University for the weekend for the Britain's Disabled Strongman and Strongwoman, where we're on the crew along with lots of other people. So he's not going to get a weekend off next weekend either. So he's just gonna have to pull up his big boy pants and get on with it. So
exactly. I was just saying this Sunday is my first weekend off. My only day off in September, pretty much, like full day off.
Yeah.
And I've got to move furniture.
Good. Well, this Sunday,
enjoyable.
This Sunday I've got Lucy Underdown at Unique Results in Chelmsford doing her deadlift seminar, which is great. So anyway, without further ado, we are joined today. Now I have been kind of mentioning him over the last few weeks, and I've butchered his name a couple of times. I'm not going to butcher his name today. We are joined by Mr. Aidan O'Flaherty, who, is that correct, Aidan?
That's spot on.
Near enough. Who is on Instagram. So we'll give a shout out at the start, or give a little plug at the start and at the end as well. But on Instagram as at the Irish Physio. Now, but Aidan is actually joining us from Putney in London, which I think is where you're based now, Aidan? Yeah.
Yeah, I've been in London for the last 10 years.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, Aidan is, like I mentioned, I don't think I mentioned what the workshop was, but Aidan's workshop that he's got coming up is running injuries and performance masterclass. And a lot of the stuff that that Aidan on his Instagram focuses on is helping people with running and endurance, injuries, rehab, injury prevention. And we're going to be talking about that today, because obviously I mentioned to Pete before we came on, lots of people, when they decide, right, it's time for me to get fit, or January or whatever, time for me to get fit, time for me to lose weight, what can I do? Well, I can go out and run because it's free. I can just step out my front door and go and do it. And most people I think that they can just go out and start running. Maybe they can. I don't know. We'll talk to Aidan about that today. But running is something that I'm sure, I know I've done a lot of in the past, not so much now. I know Pete's done a lot of in the past, not so much now. But most people at some stage have either tried running, like a couch to 5K type thing, or a park run, or maybe built up even to 10Ks, half marathons, and that sort of thing. So it's something that most of us have an experience of, or at least have tried in the past. So this is going to be a good one, and we're looking forward to talking to Aidan. So Aidan, I suppose to begin with, what would be really helpful is maybe just if you could let us know a little bit about yourself, about your background, if you have got a background in sport or athletics or running or anything yourself, and then also your background in terms of how you came to be a physiotherapist. And, how and why you decided to maybe focus a bit more on running and endurance and that sort of thing. I know that's a lot of questions I've just kind of fired at you, and you can answer them in any at length and in any order that you wish. But yeah, just tell us a bit about yourself and those things, if that's okay.
No worries, James. I'll give you the thumbnail and I won't give you a 50-minute introduction, but great to be on. So thanks, Peter and James, for having me on. So my background is I grew up in Ireland in a family, very sporting background, played a lot of, as we call it in Ireland, soccer, football over here. And I played professionally, and then I tore my ACL when I was 17. Came back after 5 months, second game back, tore it again, and then I got released from my contract. And then a couple of years after that, then I went on to sustain another ACL injury. So by the time I was 21, 22, I had 3 ACL reconstructions. And then I decided, right, well, professional football is not for me. So I know I need to do something more academic. And then that's when I got into physiotherapy, mainly through the difficulties I had with rehab and how frustrated I was that I wasn't able to get back to a high level of performance because of the re-injuries. And then from then went on to study physiotherapy. And before that, it was exercise physiology. So background in endurance testing, physiotherapy, and then postgrad in sports and exercise medicine, which I'm still undergoing that part-time. And then during COVID, well, I competed at a really high level in rowing, and that got me into endurance. And then as a lot of rowers do, when they stop rowing, they go into running. But I picked up lots of injuries as I started running because I spent about the best part of 7 years on my backside on a rowing machine and in a boat 6-7 days a week. And then from there, I just developed a love for running. And ever since, I've been lucky enough that now my full caseload is running. And I'm sure we'll go into it. I've got a quite a nice balance with my life in terms of working whilst I travel and working with elite athletes, recreational athletes. So now every day, pretty much, it is kind of endurance-based stuff and working with athletes from all over the world.
So do you have a kind of a clinic or a setup now in London? In Putney is West London, isn't it? I think.
Yeah, Southwest London. So I'm actually based in the club that I rowed out of for about 7 years, London Rowing Club. So I rent the space in there. I'm in clinic 2 to 3 days a week, and then the rest of my work is remote.
Okay, fantastic. And just a question on that the first 2 ACL injuries that you had. So you had one. I presume you had some kind of operation and rehab on it, and then you went back, and then within a couple of games, you tore the same one again, did you?
Same one again. So
Yeah.
what you would generally see now, even at the professional level in, Premier League or whether it's NFL, wherever you're living, if it's ice hockey, if you're in Canada, normally it's a minimum 9 months of rehab before you go back because the re-injury rates are significantly higher when you return to sport before 9 months. Whereas back then, which is, I'm 35 now, that was back when I was, they were looking at how many years, what's my maths like, 17 years ago. I was back playing after 5 months. So, the research and the rehab is much better now than what it was back then. But yeah, after 3 games back, I wasn't ready. I was massively underprepared, and the re-injury was obviously going to be quite a high risk. And unfortunately, that's what ended up happening.
God, we had some people on recently talking about women's football, and they talked a lot about ACL injuries in women's football, and I don't know if it's something more specific to women where she was talking about potentially during like female cycle or menstrual cycle and things where ligaments maybe undergo some where they're more slack or they're not quite so they maybe make some changes due to hormone levels or something. But I think she was trying to sort of say that there was specifically, I know football in general has ACL problems, but women's football as well, they seem to have lots and lots of ACL problems in the team. But but then how, because I did my ACL really badly when I was about 20. I think I'm 46 now, and I never had it operated on, and it's never I've just modified my life to not aggravate it or I could never play anything like football, rugby. I used to play rugby at university and stuff, football, rugby, hockey, anything. I've done a number of marathons. Running in a straight line is fine for me once I'm strong. But anything where the muscles get tired and there's any involvement of quick movement, change of direction, I can just feel the instability in my knee. So you mentioned that after, retiring from football, going into rowing as well, obviously is a linear kind of sport where you're in a boat and you're moving forwards and backwards. And then you went seriously into running yourself. How did you start with running? You came out of rowing? Did you start short distances and things and do longer distances? I mean, what was your running kind of like when you got into that?
Yeah, going back to when I actually tore my ACL the third time, I decided I've had enough of this. I'm not getting the surgery again. So I actually went 10 years without getting it reconstructed. So
Mm,
you have what we refer to as copers versus non-copers. So when you do an ACL, and there's more research coming out now where the ACL graft can actually heal itself if you brace it. So if you brace the knee at 90 degrees you have to be the right person for this in terms of, if you've got 3 kids, you're not going to be able to walk around for 4 weeks with your knee braced at 90 degrees, locked in that position. But if you're a young athlete and you've got your parents looking after you at home, you can brace the knee at 90 degrees where the both ends of the ligament are closer together. And we do see healing rates, and return to sport is quicker than when you have surgery. And obviously, you don't have the trauma of going into someone's knee. But you have copers versus non-copers. So psychologically, I was ready not to have it done.
mm,
So and I also wasn't doing any field sports. But because I was rowing a lot at a high level and doing lots of weights, I built up my hamstring, my quad strength, and that was sufficient to provide enough stability for what I needed it for.
mm.
And would you believe then, this was about 4 years ago, I had no ACL, but it was during a physio session with a footballer passing me the ball. I actually injured myself, would you believe? So
Yeah.
my knee buckled. And then from then I had a lot of instability. So I knew, in order to if I want kids to run after my kids and play with them, I needed to have more stability. So I decided to go and get the surgery. So I
Mm,
have done again. So to date now, I've had 4 ACL reconstructions, 2 on both sides, and 2 meniscus injuries. So 6 knee surgeries in total. So once I finished rowing, I just started nice, easy 5K. But after about a month, I thought, well, I'm fit, I'm strong. I was about 95 kilos, relatively low BMI because I was doing lots of rowing. And I decided I'd run a half marathon. And I was fit, I was quick, but my muscles, tendons, bones, they just weren't adapted to that load. So I picked up bilateral Achilles tendinopathy after doing that marathon. And ever since then, I've kind of struggled with that, because cardiovascularly, when you run, your body will adapt. But if you're new to running, it takes your tendons, your muscles. It takes it. You can argue a number of years for you to truly adapt to it. And this is why we see with recreational runners, the injury rates are significantly higher than those who are running for a longer period of time.
mm. This is fascinating because I mean, obviously, I'm obviously going to meet you in person in a few weeks, so I'll have a little chat with you maybe about. I don't know if there's any benefit to me actually having any surgery now at this stage in my life, or if it may have healed to a certain extent and it's and there's no need. But no, this is fantastic. So you mentioned there like runners and adapting to running, and what are the most common in obviously most people I presume come to you as a physio when they've hurt themselves or when they've already done something wrong or they're injured. Um, we'd like to think that everyone was proactive in every area of life, but most of the time it's you deal with a problem when it arises, don't you? And then you come and seek some professional help. So um, with you as a physio, what are the most common injuries that you see from recreational runners, which is probably what the majority of the people listening to the podcast will be, rather than kind of serious competitive athletes, I suppose.
The most common one that you would see is what we refer to as patellofemoral pain, which is ultimately pain around the front of the kneecap. And often it's because if you're not used to, so when we're running, our quads will take up to 4 to 5 times your body weight in peak force. So as you're striking the ground and your knee goes into mid stance, you're loading that area quite a bit. But if it's not used to that, we all have a certain capacity. So I have a certain capacity that my body can cope with. You have a certain capacity. Peter will have a certain capacity. Once we exceed that, that's where we enter the risk of injury. So it takes your body time to adapt. But most commonly, when people often they start running, they don't understand or may not have the understanding of running slow is actually very important for runners. And then we do a small percentage at a higher intensity. Most people will start off and they're out of breath. They don't like it because it feels really hard. And then what ends up happening is as you run faster, the injury risk goes up along with that. So faster running speed increases the risk of injury significantly.
Mm.
And what you tend to see is with more younger athletes, you'd see more bones and articular surfaces, so like joints. So you'll get things like growing knee pain, you'll get patellofemoral pain, you'll get pain around the ankle, in the foot, so generally more joint, but also bony related issues. With master runners, female and male, you'll tend to get more soft tissue injuries, such as like calf strains, Achilles, and that is because of things like sarcopenia. So as we get older, muscle mass, tendon naturally will start to decrease. We're not as sensitive, or our ability to adapt is affected. However, when we do things like strength training, we would massively reduce the risk of, or likely reduce the risk of, certain types of injuries. So most common ones I would say knee pain, shin splints, but it's an umbrella term. So often people say to me, oh, I've got shin splints. And I'm like, okay, is that muscle, tendon, bone? Is it vascular? Is it nerve? Lots of things can cause pain in the shin. The most common one we will see is what we refer to as medial tibial stress syndrome, which is ultimately a bony stress response. It's an overuse injury to the inside of the shin down towards the ankle. And then you've got other things. I don't know if I mentioned before, I briefly got cut off, as Achilles tendinopathy, plantar heel pain, which is also referred to a lot of people by plantar fasciitis.
So yeah, there's some real common injuries there. And I mean, this is a big question and it's a broad question. So no, what I mean is it's kind of like a kind of a complex thing, I suppose. But we see lots of people, and we all see and we all hear people, if they want to lose a bit of weight, they think, I'm going to start going out running. Now, some of these people might be carrying quite a lot of extra weight. And you mentioned when you came off of the rowing, you were a fairly kind of strong, fit, not high BMI kind of guy, because you've been training regularly with endurance. But in terms of, people who are overweight or obese running or starting running, is that something you recommend, or would you recommend maybe walking first and losing weight to then start running? Or do you see more? You mentioned 4 to 5 times body weight transference through the legs and through the whole body when you're running. Is that something that you see more injuries with people who are obviously on the heavier side? And what would your recommendations be for them generally?
It's a great question, because so many people get turned off saying, oh, you need to be conditioned to run rather than run to get conditioned. It's a catch-22, right? So you've got a higher BMI, naturally you're going to take more load. And when you refer to as how much load gets placed under the body, generally the number that you'd see in research is 3 times your body through the musculoskeletal system. But then you have certain areas such as your calf complex, which is your gastrocnemius and your soleus, those 2 muscles that form your Achilles. Combined, you take up to 11 times your body weight in peak force here. So if you've got someone who has a higher BMI than something like plantar heel pain, and they're more sedentary, or in Achilles, the risk of that is going to be high. So if you can walk and you can increase your pace whilst walking, going to a run, jog, then your chances of picking up an injury are naturally going to be less, because your running speed is lower, your overall force per stride is going to be less. But then you've also got things like, when you have an increased BMI, you get more systemic inflammation, so more metabolic factors. So such as tendons, we'd see a lot, one of the most common thing, plantar heel pain and Achilles tendinopathy. So I'd look at a term that we refer to as LIME. So lifestyle factors, your intrinsic factors, metabolic factors, and external factors. So the key one there with a higher BMI is metabolic. So if you've got a higher BMI, chances of type 2 diabetes, we know that tendons, your risk of a tendon injury such as rotator cuff, shoulder related pain, Achilles tendinopathy, is going to be much higher. So I don't say that to scare people. It's just to be aware that having a higher BMI, you are going to be at more risk of certain injuries. But it does not mean to say that you should not be running, because in order to reduce your BMI, naturally expending more calories by running is going to help, but it's doing that in a controlled manner and a very sustainable manner.
That's great, because what I heard you say there was, if someone comes in and says, right, I've got this, like, I don't know, I've got an Achilles injury. It's like, right. And you look at the person and go, okay, you're quite slim, you do a lot of running. it might be strength or whatever. But then if someone's a bit on the heavier side, it's like, right, okay, it's going to be a metabolic thing. So you don't like, because you said you do some like remote stuff and you've obviously got an Instagram channel, but it's not like, oh, here's the 5 best exercises you can do for an Achilles injury. It's like, that's just like clickbait, isn't it? Because it's look at the person who comes in.
It's one of the biggest challenges that I face on social media is
Yeah.
dealing with this misinformation. And that stuff sells, quick sells, fast stuff sells. But what I might give one person for an Achilles tendinopathy could be significantly different to what I give another person for Achilles tendinopathy. So you could have some person that is working, let's say, as a nurse or a postman, and they're walking 20,000 steps a day. Well, that's going to contribute much more to someone who's, say, got an office-based job. So as someone who has 3 kids and doesn't have time to go to the gym for an hour, there's lots of different ways that you can treat an injury, but it's looking at that low-hanging fruit. What's more important for the individual? Like you said, if someone who's a high BMI and there's massive metabolic issues, then that's not going to be the same as an elite level runner who's got a lower BMI. It really is down to the individual.
So I was going to ask, with regards to general advice, and you mentioned it actually a little while ago, general kind of advice that will help kind of prehab or build more resilience and robustness for runners and help them to maybe there's always any physical activity or sport that any of us do, there's always a risk of injury somewhere. You can never 100% eliminate it, but to kind of reduce that risk, you mentioned about sort of strength training and supplementing running with strength training. I think, how does that work, or is that something you recommend for runners to do? Because a lot of runners, I mean, I've known lots of them in my time. They're especially if they're a member of a running club, they just run, and they maybe run 4, 5, 6 days a week. And do no other kind of strength work outside of running. They may do tempo runs and hill sprints and track sessions and various types of running, but in terms of actual building strength, they do very little of that. Is that something you recommend across the board, pretty much?
It is. I'm very biased as a physio towards strength training, but for a very good reason. When you look at things like bone health, tendon health, reducing risk of falls in elderly, we see people who strength train tend to live longer. People who run tend to live longer. It reduces your all-cause mortality, if I can get this stat right, by about 38%. So cardiovascular disease being the #1 killer in the world, those who run even once per week will tend to have significantly less risk of these types of things. So #1, I always say, right, there's the selling point. But then #2 is running comes with high loads and injuries are going to happen. But we want to encourage people that you can do a huge amount to reduce the risk of certain injuries. And strength training is one key area. So, but why is that? So if you think about when you're running, you're hitting the ground, your tissues and tendons, etc., taking high amount of load. Let's say, James, you have a twin brother and you're both the exact same VO2 max, you've got the same endurance level, but you're able to leg press your body weight. Your twin is only, say, able to leg press 50% of their body weight. That means that your higher strength, you're likely going to be a bit more efficient because for a specific running speed, you have higher strength, so you use less energy to maintain that speed. It's what we refer to as running economy. So you can improve running efficiency through strength training as it improves your running economy. Now, often people will think, well, running is, it's an endurance sport, so surely I need to do higher reps and lower weight, whereas it's actually the opposite. Train like a sprinter, it's like lift heavy for fewer repetitions. Because what that does is it improves your neuromuscular capabilities to be able to produce force quickly, like rate of force development. I might get someone that comes in with knee pain and I'll assess their strength. They might be quite strong, but because they might have pain, their ability to produce force is reduced. So then when I get them to train this and they'll come back 4 or 6 weeks later, all of a sudden their rate of force is much better, which is key for running. Because when you hit the ground, you want muscles to be able to produce force quickly, transfers that energy to the tendon to store energy, release energy. So by strength training, we can improve that stiffness, and I use stiffness in a positive term. Our legs are like springs. When we run, we store energy, we release energy. Heavy resistance training plus things like plyometrics are massively going to help improve that function, which then in turn is going to help you perform better when it comes to running performance as well.
It's funny actually, because this is just an aside. It's just popped in my head, but me and James have watched it recently. There's a documentary about Terry Todd, who's a strength coach in the States, and he's researched it. I think he's got his own like institute in that, hasn't he? He's dead now, but the story about him when he was younger was he was getting into like strongman training, and he played tennis, and it was in this was it in the 70s?
It was really early, because it was at the, I want to say it's back in the black and white times.
Yeah,
and it's when
before colour was invented.
It's where, yeah, before colour was invented, and it was when sports people were told not to strength train, because it would slow them down and make them muscle bound, and it would tighten them up, and they wouldn't be able to play the sport. So it was probably back in, like, I'd imagine it was around the 50s. It was quite
Possibly, yeah.
It was quite early, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
he was a tennis player, and he was bigger, and he was a tall guy anyway, but he was bigger and heavier because of the strength training he did, and he was building muscle than most of the football players, like American football players. But he was winning all these tennis matches because he wasn't getting injured. And he couldn't move around as quick, but he could hit the ball harder, and he wasn't getting hurt. And obviously that's an extreme, but that's what, like, this is how what do you call it? Information changes in the science. The science doesn't change, actually, does it? Because science is science. The actual understanding of it changes, I suppose, over time, or the way it's what would you call it? Applied. But yeah, so what you're saying about strength training, I think is great, because that's where like James says, a lot of people will run and I've got strong legs because I run, and it's like, well, yeah, but it all, like, if you want to run faster or you want to run further or whatever, if you do some strength training, then actually it'll make it easier, and it doesn't take as long if you've not got as much time.
Absolutely. People often say, one of the arguments, well, the Kenyans don't strength train, and I spent a month in Kenya. East Africans being like the best endurance runners in the world. I spent a month in Kenya earlier this year, teaching a course, but also delving into some of the best coaches in Kaptagat, the best centers, etc. And when you look at them, when they grow up, we were walking up a hill one day, and it was about 10% gradient. You're at 2,400 meters of altitude, and I was puffing. This kid, no more than, I would say, 7, 2 jerry cans of water, barefoot, walks up, looking at me, just starts laughing, and I'm thinking, how in the name of God? So
how did that make you feel?
Yeah, very blessed in the terms of, like, I've got access to clean water, but also pretty shit that physiologically these people. But what it did to me was it highlighted that we're all built differently, particularly in the Western world. We've got luxuries of, when we're young, we're fairly sedentary, playing, particularly nowadays when we're on computer games, all this kind of stuff. Over there, they have to graft just to get clean water. They have to walk long distance. They're barefoot. They're up and down hills. They're lifting things. So just because they might not be in the gym lifting heavy weights, it doesn't mean to say that they can't produce a high amount of force. And I've done this whilst I was there. I tested their ability to produce force and their strength in terms of their percentage of body weight. And it's off the chart. And that's no reason, I can now understand why they're quite efficient when they run. Yes, they live at high altitude, and they've got long tendons, they've got long shin bone, and that kind of whatever that word is. I think it's
anthropometry.
Anthropometry. Thank you very much. So they're all based, they're Kalenjins, they're the one tribe, and they're just designed, their bodies are designed for that, but they also work really hard at it. So just because they don't doesn't mean to say that we don't. And when you have runners who are coming in with, for example, if I ask either one of you, James, tell me the last injury or one injury that caused you a lot of issues over the past. Give me an idea.
Most recent was like a right shoulder. And it wasn't caused by any trauma. It was just a kind of a niggle that kind of seemed to hang around for a long time,
Yeah. And Peter, give me an idea of something that might have caused you issues.
Left shoulder. I hurt it. Fell over snowboarding, hurt a rib, and it's been giving me jip for the last 14 years.
And I guess both of you lift weights, do things like that. Yeah, there you go, right? So if anyone else is listening, wherever you are around the world, think of an injury that has caused you issues, right? The biggest risk factor for an injury is a history of an injury. It sounds negative initially. So the fact that you've had a shoulder injury, you're much more likely to get it again. No. So both of you have had shoulder pain. There's likely been a point where you've been a bit fearful of using it because you don't want to make it worse. Is that a fair point?
Yeah.
Yep.
So then what happens is the area deconditions. So then when you're in a position where you need to use force, now all of a sudden that area cannot produce the force. It doesn't have the same capacity. Therefore, you might have a flare up and you get stuck in this cycle. So a physio's job is to identify where the deficits might be. It might be strength. It might be psychological. You see some people with back pain, they have a terrible fear of bending and deadlifting because they don't want to make it worse because of misinformation. It's bad for you. So lots of times when people come into me and they pick up injuries, one thing I will look at is there any particular deficit as a result of them having pain for a long period? So we don't know if the weakness has been there pre-injury or if it's come on because they've been in pain for a long period of time. We don't have a huge amount of prospective data. It's more retrospective. But what we do see is, 6+ weeks after, we often see these deficits. But then you get the psychological, which certain injuries are more common, particularly back pain, pain around the front of the knee. People they don't want to squat. So you also have to treat that. So it's not just the limb you're treating a person, you're treating an individual. And if you neglect that, you may struggle to get someone where they want to be. But ultimately, my job is to rehab you to a really high level where the demands of your sport are here, but I want you to be able to perform up to here rather than the demands of your sport are here. If anyone can't see, I'm using a hand as an analogy. Think of a glass of water full. That's your big capacity. But when you get injured, that glass of water empties. You need to fill that glass back up, fill that capacity. So therefore, we know you can withstand the demands of what you want to do in life with your training.
It's funny, actually, because the coach I work with, Paul McElroy, which James does as well, I've been doing pressing either side, and my right was way stronger than my left because of the old injury. So we just took the weight right back down. I was actually doing 2 different programs for different arms because this one has now caught this one up. Because we found a weight that's where I could press the belt and didn't feel any pain whatsoever. And then we went like much lower than that weight and started from there, and just it took about 6 months or so, just lifting, increasing the volume and then bringing the volume back down and increasing the weight slightly and bringing it up, back down, increase the weight slightly while doing something different on my right arm. And then they've both kind of evened up. So this brings me to a question, actually. And this is really interesting. I saw it was Adam Meekins who was talking about this. And we've actually had him on the podcast, but he's kind of exploded since then. So he'll not come back on again. He doesn't speak to the likes of us.
He will come back on because
I'm only joking.
I'll get back on. Yeah,
I'm only joking. But he was saying, because people then shy away from pain, right? Because they used to say no pain, no gain back in the day, which is like a scary thing to say, isn't it? And but like pain's an interesting one because you can be lifting something or doing something and it hurts. So then people are like, well, don't do it. But then you go to see a physio, and some people go and see a physio and go, oh, it was great. They've got right in there and it really hurt and all of that. And it's like, well, why is that good? Like, why is that a good stimulus or like response or whatever when lifting a weight isn't? And we're probably going into an area here where it's if like when people are listening, they're like, oh, so it's okay to lift in pain then. But it's like, well, again, it's different, isn't it? But I don't know. I suppose I'm trying to. The question I'm trying to ask is like, how do we experience pain? Do you know what I mean? It's like,
yeah, no, I know the point you're making.
Yeah,
it's such an important one for people to understand. And I'm a huge fan of Adam Meekins, and one of his phrases, "You can't go wrong being strong," and I agree, right? But when someone is dealing with pain experience is different from an individual level. Now, I'm no expert when it comes to pain, but what you mentioned earlier, you found an entry level when you were rehabbing your shoulder. You found an entry level where pain was acceptable for you. So if you were to push through high levels of pain, you probably wouldn't want to do it because it's a negative experience. So when someone comes into me, and as an example, this morning, I have a female elite 1500-meter runner, and she's dealing with an Achilles injury, but psychologically she feels incredibly weak. When I looked at her numbers, they were incredibly good. So a lot of it was reassurance that it's okay for you to experience a low level of symptoms. Now, it depends on the injury. So for soft tissue, such as tendon, muscle, 0 to 4 out of 10 is acceptable, providing it settles within a 24-hour pain pattern. Now, where if you're looking at, let's say you're looking at something like a bone stress fracture, then 0 pain. Like, you need to offload that stuff. You need to give it time to actually heal. Otherwise, you'll make it significantly worse. So what I would look for with an individual is, what movement are you fearful of, whether it's shoulder or knee, whatever it is. And then I get them to do it. They might say that's a 6 out of 10. Okay, how can we make this easier? Can we get you to do it with a band to take some of your body weight off? Okay, that's better. Find an entry level, know and reassure them it's okay for you to experience a low level of symptoms or what is acceptable for you. Then you found an entry level, you build up a bit of trust, and then you can start progressing from there. And over time, you're delving into that kind of biopsychosocial aspect. You're understanding how they perceive pain, how they perceive their injury. And then you're able to unlock that. And when they build trust with you, that's where then the real kind of progress that you can make. But it comes back to treat the person, the individual.
Everything does, doesn't it? That's the problem.
Yeah. No, this is great. I mean, a lot of what you're talking about, we also had, I don't know, do you know Phil Maffetone? He was like, he's a very endurance kind of based, he's probably about 70 now, Phil Maffetone, I'd imagine. We've had him on the podcast a couple of times, but he was very much into, originally sort of trained triathletes in the, I want to say 70s and 80s, or Ironman sort of triathletes. And he has his math method of, because it ties in something you said earlier about most people, when they start trying to run, they start trying to run too fast and they find it very hard to run slowly. But what they need to do is build up their probably aerobic capacity and tissue resilience and things at a slow pace. But I know from trying to do the math, from running the math method myself, which is keeping the heart rate very low while running, most people struggle and think, oh, it's too slow for me, I'm just going to run faster. And the faster they go, the more injuries they're going to get. That's the first point. Second one you mentioned, we had Stu McGill on as well. We had Adam Meekins on and Stu McGill. And I know there's Meekins and McGill. Meekins got a few things to say about McGill now. but McGill's been around for decades, at a high level in Canada. And he's very interesting as well from a, like you say, that he's more, I suppose, from a, if something really hurts, avoid it. And then because you just keep reinforcing the pain, I suppose, and you want to avoid going into into positions or things that are going to be painful. So there were just two things I thought. And the third thing, you've mentioned it twice when you were talking about being in Kenya, I think. You mentioned barefoot. Now, one thing I wanted to talk to you about or ask you about was, because years and years ago, I mean, I have to admit, I lived my life barefoot or in minimal shoes. And I read Born to Run 15 years ago. And you mentioned in Kenya, what's your view on, I know, and this is possibly different for everybody, on kind of spending time barefoot, increasing foot strength and allowing the foot to spread, potentially running in minimalist shoes or less cushion shoes, versus, kind of wearing orthotics for, overpronation and supination, and all this kind of, and athletic shoes. Because physios, from my perspective, from what I see, kind of, you get some who are very kind of like barefoot and everything, and you get others who are more, and you could probably get some pragmatic in the middle. I just wondered what your kind of thoughts were around that whole thing.
Yeah, I think the way the world is going now within running, you're either one or the other. You're in the high stack shoe camp or you're a minimalist barefoot. I think I'm not going to sit in the fence, but I think you need to be pragmatic about it. So the errors that I would see people making is like when they read Born to Run, straight away, I'm going to run long distance barefoot. But all of a sudden you're changing the amount of forces significantly at the foot and ankle. So things like those people who go into minimalist shoes, your load placed on the second metatarsal is significantly high. the risk of developing an injury there is going to be much higher. Around the Achilles, your load is going to be higher in minimalist shoes versus higher stack shoes. I am a fan of people doing barefoot walking around the house to build, that kind of sensation, intrinsic foot strength. I'm a massive fan of foot strengthening. Now, foot strengthening isn't picking up a towel with your feet or pushing your big toe down into a band. You need heavy load onto your feet for the amount of load that they take. So I might get someone in, for example, like referred to as a foot bridge, where they have their heel on a weighted plate and their toes on a weighted plate, and then they've got a bar above them. So you're driving your foot down into that footbridge position, but you're driving into a fixed bar position. So you're applying as much force as you can. But that kind of foot strengthening is, for me, I would say that's proper foot strengthening. Things like plyometrics as well, barefoot, but it's building up the tissue tolerance again. It's not going, like, your body won't like massive changes in load. So if you go from one to the other and it's going to lead to a spike, your injury risk will go up. Whereas if someone wanted to run in barefoot shoes and you're used to running in stacked shoes, make it a very gradual progression. Make it gradual, allow your body to adapt to it over time, and you're naturally going to reduce your risk of injury. But I'm not against it. I think for me, I like when people have a rotation. They have a shoe for a longer, easier run. They have something for a shorter, faster run, and they just have, a shoe for walking or whatever it might be. And a bit of a shoe geek, so any excuse for.
Well, I love that. So let's blow up the internet right now. Is it heel strike or toe strike?
Is it what, sorry?
Heel strike or toe strike?
What's better?
Let's blow up the internet. Come on. You're not allowed to sit on the fence on this one.
I suppose it depends what shoes you're wearing, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, are you asking me what's better? Foot, like striking on your toes or heel?
I'm just being stupid.
No, but that is interesting. So more of a heel strike, or like a kind of more of a midfoot, forefoot strike. What would you, in terms of running mechanics?
This is one issue I come up with all the time. And, I'll have made, I'm not saying this, saying, oh, I know everything. I've made this mistake in the past. Whereas I will say to someone, oh, you're much better to run forefoot than you are heel strike. You'll see a lot of running coaches, clinicians advise that. Whereas when you look at the data, around 83% of runners will be rear foot to heel strike. And then the longer you run, that goes up closer to 90%. What I would be more looking at is where your heel strikes the ground in relation to your center of mass. So if you have a foot strike where your toe is pointing way in the air, that often is linked with an overstride and a high vertical oscillation, which we know then puts a lot of peak vertical forces, higher braking forces. We see more correlation with shin splints and that type of stuff with that injury. So for me, I don't mind if you're heel strike or forefoot. I'd be more looking at the other things around it, where you're striking in relation to your center of mass and how much like vertical oscillation, which is how much height your center of mass is going up and down per stride.
That's really interesting, because it might have been Phil Maffetone who mentioned this, but I can't remember. But he was talking about stride length, and most people, and I could be wrong, I think this is what he said, most people think like they tend to stride out too far, and they should do shorter strides, because you've just said if your center of mass is off and it's behind your leg, then you've got to use a lot of force through your leg to pull you forwards.
The braking force is higher. So that we often do when someone has let's say a long stride or an overstride, I will look at increasing cadence. Like increasing cadence there's so much research around gait retraining. So let's say naturally someone might take 160 steps per minute. If I bring them up to 170 for the same pace, they might feel less efficient initially, but what I would often do is do that to reduce the load on sensitive areas. So for example, knee pain, if someone has pain in front of their knee, they've got an overstride, increase the cadence can immediately reduce the loads on the area, and often they feel less pain.
Because I remember when I first read that Born to Run, I did a 6-week kind of, and it was maybe an 8-week intro to kind of barefoot running kind of course. And it was like you say, it was very, very gradual, because most people, I remember back in the day, probably going back 15 years or more now, people were buying these Vibram 5 fingers, and going out running and running exactly the same way they were running in their running shoes and getting like heel injuries and Achilles injuries and all the rest of it. So when I built it up very, very gradually, it kind of progressed and it was all good. And the other thing, one thing you just mentioned, where you mentioned brake force, I know Pete does a hell of a lot of walking and kind of like mountain walking and things. And I do quite a lot of walking and have recently been in Devon and Cornwall walking. And is that why? Because I presume it sounds like the same sort of thing with brake force. It's a lot harder for most people to walk downhill or down a mountain than it is up, or it's different because walking up, you've got more kind of quad and more muscular. On the way down, you're having to almost put the brakes on every single step, aren't you? And then that can lead to front of knee pain, because like you say, it's almost you're having to use those brake forces every step. Is that from a walking perspective what's happening?
Great point. I just spent a week in Chamonix at the UTMB, which is the Ultra Trail de Mont Blanc, and I'm watching people running 160K, and you see how much they're suffering on the back end. And when you're looking at running forces and loads, gradient plays a huge contributing factor. So if you think about running or walking up the stairs, what happens is your heart rate goes up, right? So you have higher demand physiologically on the body because you're pushing against gravity. Therefore, your muscle is producing more load and your heart rate goes up. You'll have higher loads on your hip as you go uphill and on your calf complex. So think when you're walking uphill, how much you feel your calves the next day. Coming down the hill, you have a lot of eccentric load on your quads. And that's the best way to train for downhill is to actually run downhill. Just do it gradually over time. You can do lots of stuff in the gym that might help. But ultimately, to train for hills, you need to be training on hills. So downhill, you'll often get a lot of people who will feel a lot of knee pain. So when someone comes to me and they're dealing with knee pain, I will get them to run on a 3 or 4% incline on a treadmill straight away. There's significantly less pain in the knee because the eccentric force on the knee can be up to around 40% less going up on a 3 to 4% gradient.
I know that we've had Dan John on about 10 times, I think, haven't we, Pete? Coach, something like that. But he talks a lot about running uphill for conditioning, and he calls it like a self-limiting exercise, so that he says he's never known anyone, and he does a lot of athletics and sports training in the States. He said people don't get injured running uphill because you like you say, there's not the eccentric load. You're running uphill, it tires you much quicker, and you just basically slow down or stop because it's just that, you're running up. It's not the same as running on a flat or running downhill. That kind of running uphill for conditioning is very different. Were you going to say something, Pete? Sorry, I jumped in.
No, it's interesting because here's another question. Because I was in the lakes for the last, a couple of weeks ago. And I do lots of walking around Bath's in a bowl. There's hills, but not super hills, right? So I walk up and down them all the time. But it's all like public footpaths. And then I went to the lakes, and when I'm staying in, so I live in a flat with no stairs. When I'm staying in the lakes, if we're staying somewhere that's got stairs, when I'm walking down the stairs in the morning after walking up and down mountains, my calves are so tight that I'm like, I have to hold the banister, and I'm like, oh, blimey, that's it. But then that goes after a couple of days because I get used to it. But that's instead of walking up public footpaths and stuff, it's walking up rocks more so, isn't it? And then coming back down again, obviously. But so even just the terrain, not even the shoe, that's wearing the same shoes, but the terrain changes it. So what would you say about people who are out running, say, but they run on the flat all the time, going out and not necessarily running, but going for a walk on something that's a bit more, even if it's flat, just a bit more rocky. So each step is different, and does that help, I suppose?
Yeah, so running surface, I like when people run on different surfaces because I think it adds that element of robustness, resilience, and you don't feel like you need to run around Battersea Park where it's nice and flat every single week. So I like when runners have the ability to do that. And again, going back to when I was in Kenya, they run in the forest, they run on track, they run on dirt roads, hills, etc. And I think that adds an element of resilience as well. You'll often find runners who they have one area where they run and they feel safe in that. But then when they're forced to run somewhere else, then all of a sudden it's like the psychological aspect. Oh, I'm not sure. I've not run on hills or this type of surface before. Chances of them picking up an injury you could argue would be higher in those who have those psychological factors related to that. So I'm a big fan on running on different surfaces, walking on different surfaces. The one thing I would say, going back earlier, James, to your point, and Peter, this comes to your point as well, is when you run on different surfaces, the load is different. Using an example, think of running on sand, how much you feel your calves. Now, when you run on sand and softer surface, the load on the muscle is greater mechanically. That transfers more load to the bone. What people might think is the opposite. People are, oh, I've got a bone injury, I'm going to run on soft surface. So the greatest load placed on bones is through muscle contraction. So running uphill places significant more load on the tibia and the shin. So someone who has shin splints, I might get them, they're doing lots of hill stuff, I'll get them to avoid running hills to let things settle. So to answer your question, yes, I'm a big fan of it. But again, it comes back to if you start doing too much of different surfaces in a short period of time, it may increase the risk on certain structures. But walking, then it's obviously the load is a lot less, right?
This is really, really great, Aidan. And I have to say, when you come to Unique Results on the 5th of October, I'm going to have to get myself a pen and a pad and sit at the back of the room, I think, and make this is really great. So just as we start to wrap up, and then we'll kind of just maybe mention the workshop and how people can look at booking onto that. We started off almost back probably half an hour, 40 minutes ago. We were talking about strength training for runners. Now, I know there's no such thing as a blanket kind of protocol or program that everyone should do, but in general, if someone doesn't have injuries, they're fit, they're healthy, they've got no issues with anything, what would be a good, if you had to give, I don't know, 3 to 5 exercises that would be kind of good for most runners to do in terms of strength training?
Great question. And I'll use a study, a very famous study that was done by a guy called Chris Beattie in the University of Limerick. And it was done on high level runners, but we can relate this to recreational as well. And what they did was they followed runners for 40 weeks. And what they did was one group strength trained for 20 weeks, and then that was preseason. The other group strength trained for 20 weeks preseason, and then they also reduced to 1 session per week in season. So 40 weeks in total. And what they picked was only, I think it was around 5 exercises. So those who strength trained for the first 20 weeks, they massively improved their power output, their running performance significantly improved. And then during in season, they went to 1 session. They were able to maintain their strength, but then improve what we call your reactive strength, which is, for example, the ability to store and release energy. Those runners who didn't do any training in season, their reactive strength significantly reduced. No, so to come back to the question, we know that runners who strength train pre-season, if you're recreational, even around events, you're going to get a benefit from it. You don't need to be in the gym doing 10, 12 exercises. So I would often do something like a compound lift. It might be back squat, deadlift, trap bar deadlift. If you don't like doing these types of exercises, I might get someone to do a leg press because they might feel safer. So when you're doing that, you feel safe, you can produce a high amount of force. It's multi-joint, so you can strengthen hips, quads, or hamstrings, etc. in one movement. Arguably, the most important muscle group for running is the calf complex. Well, I would say it is. Most people will undervalue it. When we're looking at calf strength, single leg calf raises, if you have access to a gym, you can use a leg press or you can use something like a Smith machine. So I'd always focus on the calves. And if we're looking at how heavy should we go, we see those who can produce 1.5 to 2 times their body weight in force tend to have less injuries around that area. So if you have a runner who is 70 kilos or 80 kilos, let's say 80 kilos, well, I want you to be able to produce 6 to 8 reps of 40 kilo weight. Now, you're not going to hold 40 kilos. You might use something like a Smith machine. I say that because most people will just do 20 reps of body weight and you're underloading. So then you look at other things, and you might have a jumping based exercise, such as a jump squat or pogo hops, because that works on your power and your ability to store and release energy. And then at the end of the session, you might do something like trunk work, such core specific planks, side planks. So keep it simple. Twice a week is effective. It's sufficient. Around races, you might reduce to one session per week, and you might focus on less heavier loads and more kind of plyometric jumping type stuff. Yeah, hopefully people can get some tips from that.
Yeah, and just I've just got one kind of follow-up question on that just before we wrap up, is from a running perspective. So obviously you can do kind of like a bilateral movement, which would be maybe like a squat where you're using, or a deadlift where both legs are being used at the same time, or like a unilateral movement where maybe more like a lunge where you've got one leg forwards and you're kind of more working one leg at a time. Is there any benefit for a runner, because you're constantly switching from one leg to the other, to doing more of the single leg unilateral kind of work over the kind of general power strength that you'll get from doing bilateral stuff?
Yeah. So if I'm programming for a runner, which I've got, my multiple runners who are competing in Paris in the Olympics, I'll program their stuff very similar to someone who's just took up running. Like this, it's not rocket science. You don't need to complicate it. So how I would normally structure a session is I'd have a couple of warm-up exercises. I might have one compound lift, which is your back squat, etc. And then I would go to what people refer to as accessory movements or single leg movements. That might be single leg calf raise, single leg alternating return lunges, or you might do a Bulgarian split squat. Side plank, one side, then onto the other side. So I might pick maybe 2 or 3 accessory movements that are single leg, unilateral. And then at the end, then I might include 1 or 2 where it's more reactive strength, jumping, plyometric. So to answer your question, yes, because when you're doing a compound lift, if you have one leg that's stronger than the other, it's easy to hide that. When you come to single leg, then it identifies things more. I'll give you an example. I had a runner in this morning, and we assessed her lateral hip strength, and she had a 35% deficit on one side. She has reoccurring Achilles issues. We see those who have Achilles issues tend to have deficit in hip strength. So if I gave her just compound movements, the chances of me getting that strength back up might not be great, because she might be favoring the stronger side. So I think for injuries and reduction of injuries, single leg work is definitely key.
That's, yeah, really great. That's brilliant. Now, on the 5th of October, 2 weeks' time, you're going to be in Chelmsford in Essex. And Principal Physiotherapy, Dave Adkins, who's been on the podcast before, has arranged for you to come and do your running injuries and performance masterclass. Now, obviously, you've given loads of information in the last hour, which is fantastic. But this is going to be, I think, a full day on a Saturday, and it's aimed more at, is it aimed at sort of physios and therapists and people who are treating and dealing with runners themselves? Is that correct?
That's correct. So if you're a running coach and you want to attend, I'm sure you'll gain a lot of useful information. Some of the best running coaches that I work with are those that have a good understanding of injuries. They know when to catch them and refer on before it becomes something that's too much. So it's a one-day course. It's an overview of running related injuries where we will delve into a couple of key ones. Obviously, with a one-day course, you can't treat every single thing. But the idea behind is I want to give clinicians and other healthcare professionals not so much a cheat book, but something where they feel like, okay, I know how I can systematically look at a runner. What are the key things I need to identify, and how can I get them back running safely? So what I'm also going to create is some useful guides around strength training for running, how we can get more runners into clinics, how we can become busier. Ultimately, we're a business at the end of the day. We need to pay our bills. And in a very ethical way, of course, getting them into the clinic, not injuring them and then getting them in. Look, I love this. I'm lucky enough. I teach a course in Kenya. I teach in France a couple of times a year. And now I just want to bring this to the UK and Ireland and start getting into clinics. And also, it's just getting physios together and just building that bit of a community. Like, I'm lucky enough, I'm in a WhatsApp group and we've got about 15 running physios. And anytime we've got a tricky case, we'll upload questions. So it helps, particularly if you're private practice and you're not working in, the healthcare. It's good to have people to reach out to, and naturally over time your learning just develops and continues developing.
That's fantastic. So that's Saturday, the 5th of October, in Chelmsford in Essex. It's only about half an hour outside of London, for physios, for therapists, for running coaches. This is going to be a great opportunity to spend a whole day with Aidan, and hopefully, I mean, this has been a great hour with him. I've already learnt lots, and given me lots to think about as well. So, and the best place first of all, for people to follow you, Aidan, it's at the Irish Physio. Is that where you're most active on Instagram? Is that correct?
That's where I'm most active. Yes. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I think for people to book, if they go to the principal Physio, I think he's got all the sign-ups and stuff on there. Have you got the sign-ups on your one as well?
If you're interested, I have the landing page on my website. So best place really is just reach out to me, message me. I'll send you the link directly so you can book on.
Excellent, brilliant, and and look out for that, because I'll be promoting that as well over the next couple of weeks.
And if anyone comes, James, through this podcast, we'll give them the early bird price.
Fantastic.
So that ultimately they get £50 off.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. So if you mention Health Oddity when you book, if you speak to Dave or if you speak to Aidan, mention Health Oddity, and you'll get the early bird discount price on that, which is great. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Aidan. That's brilliant. And I really look forward to meeting you in person in a few weeks. And I didn't realise you were only in London, so you're not too far away at all. So I'm sure we'll be able to connect again. Anything you'd like to say, Pete, as we wrap up?
Only one thing. When you talk about accessory exercises, in my head, I always think of them as easier exercises, but they're not. You said like Bulgarian split squats. Oh,
leg accessory. Yeah.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay.
If it doesn't challenge you, it doesn't change you.
Exactly.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Aidan, for joining us. That was really, really interesting. I'm sure people have got a lot from that. Please do give Aidan a follow at the Irish Physio. And like I say, if you're one of these people who this workshop is going to be beneficial for and aimed at, please do get in touch and book onto that as well. Make sure you say you heard Aidan on Health Oddity. That would be great. We will be back next week. I'm just finalising the guests for next week. A couple of weeks' time, we've got Claire Rafferty on, who is a global master coach for High Rocks and one of the race directors as well. So we've got Claire on. We've got lots of other people lined up. Pete and I, in a couple of weeks, will be at the Britain's Disabled Strongman and Strongwoman at Brunel University. Well, I say a couple of weeks. It's by the time you listen to this, it would have already happened.
Last week.
But we're Health Oddity is sponsoring that event. So we will see you next week, though, for episode 213. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Health Odyssey with Peter Lant, Paul Bassett, and James St. Pierre. To get your regular fix of hype-free health, you can subscribe and leave a review wherever you get your favourite podcasts. You can find out more on today's and other topics at healthodyssey.com, or find us on Facebook or Instagram by searching for Health Oddity.